Also for the thank you very much. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to discuss with you one of my favorite topics, the rise and spread of behavioral expertise in public policy. And I have chosen the phrase "a nudge world in the making," which is actually from a paper very recent paper by Brooke on the digital farmer. And I thought that this could also be interesting for you at the Thayer Institute for Agricultural Sciences. And I have chosen most of my examples from the fields of agriculture, food safety, and food security. And I'm really happy to be at my former alma mater at the Humboldt University today. Let me start with a little historical detour, just to clarify my research interests. I'm not so much interested in developing and designing nudges. I'm more interested in relationships between science and policy, in the way science and policy are co-constructing political and social orders. And as you can see here, there are two rather famous frontispieces. One very famous made by Abraham Boss for Hobbes, the Leviathan, with the insignia of his sovereignty, a composite figure of all his citizens. And on the right-hand side, a strikingly parallel political iconography, again, a frontispiece from a book by Amthor, The Project of Economics, he calls that. It's roughly 60 years later. These, despite the similarities, these two authors couldn't be more different. Hobbes insists that the state is based on geometry and arithmetics, that there is a rational calculus that helps people to learn that they have to transfer their rights, actually everything, to the Leviathan to be safe and to avoid civil war and to avoid and to reach the Hobbesian form of order. And he was fighting for this. Also in the context of a dispute with Robert Boyle, the founder of the Academy of Sciences, the National Academy in Great Britain, who had a very different approach, an empirical approach, an experimental approach. Chapin and Scheffer have written a wonderful book about this. And in the end, Boyle succeeds. And Amthor's book is the result of this, a shift to empirical sciences. The Economica, in her left hand, she is holding symbols of value chains and value creation. It's all about statistics, all about understanding how economics works and how really values are created, how many people are living in the country, and so on. That is Amthor's interest, and he maintains that this is the true basis for government. That every theorists, and we are seeing them here, the Platonians and the Aristotelians, and the religious advisors and the advisors at the court, they are all sitting down because empirical experimental economica has a triumph in this context. And this is, of course, also changing, and that is the idea, the ways political order is conceived of, and also how political order is structured. I have a third frontispiece for you from a quite influential British report, Mindspace, an acronym, from the British Cabinet Office, published by a small unit that would then become the Behavioral Insights team in the UK. Mindspace shows another subject of governing and another way of gaining data and another way of governing. Governing through the cognitive systems of the citizens, governing through identifying the biases, the habits, the defaults, the forms of priming and framing the effects of citizens, using these biases to steer their behavior in the right direction and achieving what has been called by two famous authors, Thaler and Sunstein, happiness and health, wealth, and happiness. This is the core idea, and a very different approach, but still a form of co-producing order in the relationship between science and policy. And I would like, basically, my presentation has just two parts. In the first part, I'm asking, how can we explain the rise of these forms of behavioral public policy? And the second part puts forward an assumption, a thesis about the inherent politics of behavioral public policy. What are the inherent political dynamics? What are the consequences for democracy? Then I will say some concluding words. And my core assumption for the first part is that really to achieve this status of experts, behavioral experts, behavioral scientists had to couple political and epistemic authority. They had to make their findings scientifically valued, but also politically relevant. And that would actually be my definition of an expert. People who are able to couple political and epistemic authority, and that is a different and difficult task. And I would like to demonstrate here in the context of behavioral public policy as a case, really an illustrating example, how this works based on my research. Just a brief introduction in the thinking. You all know this kind of research. Has been a wonderful experiment in the 90s, which is quite famous. It has been repeated over and over again. Supermarkets selling wine. When the French music is playing, they are selling more bottles of French wine. When the German music is playing, they are selling more bottles of German wine. And we don't know anything about the music they're playing. It's probably horrible, but it seems to have some impact. And this is the core idea, that choice architectures are being designed, that they are changed to change the behavior of people. And this was published in Nature and everything. So it is recognized as some kind of some science-based understanding of behavior. Now, the background of this has been developed by people inter alia like Kahneman, Tversky, and the core idea is, and I won't talk too much about this, just briefly, so that we get an understanding that there is a system one and a system two. The one is intuitive, the other one is reflective. There is a mechanism, a switch mechanism, and under conditions of complexity, even if you give a presentation, you know, the way you're looking at things is getting focused because system one is switching in. It's switched in, and this is helpful whenever you have to concentrate it. Have to be concentrated whenever you really need to focus on things. Then it becomes associative and rapid, and your implicit knowledge, your tacit knowledge is activated. But that is the core assumption, the assumption that sometimes, for example, under the conditions of a complex capitalist society, people act against their own interests because of these biases. They consume what is not what is best for them, but what is immediately visible for them, or what is somehow attractive for them. And of course, marketing is using these examples and knows all this because, well, it's also a Nobel Prize winning science here, Nobel Prize by Kahneman. So why not use these insights to counter-nudge the industry and to steer people into the right direction? And I'll give you just some examples from very, very many examples you already know. I think the most famous in the food politics context is the food pyramid from the United States Department of Agriculture. It has been questioned for a very long time. It existed for a very long time. And behavioral experts argued that it is really unclear. The message is not clear. The message leads to confusion. You know, you don't know what are these symbols. How stressful is it to go up the pyramid? Where is the guy falling down the pyramid? Is it going into the light? Should it go into the light? We don't know. It's really unclear. So they changed it, simplified it. Simplification is one of these very basic nudges. You know that. Simplified it and turned it into the food plate, which is now used everywhere in the United States. Second example, famous example, on the way, research on the way to Nutri-Score, one could say food traffic lights that should make salient, visible those foods that are better for you, that are nutritious. And they, in Australia, years ago, they have experimented with this. I think it's very well known for you, but there have been lots and lots of experimental approaches on this. Well, the European Union, with its from fork to farm approach and strategy, will adopt this, and it's being spread on a voluntary basis. I think you know much more about this than I do, but it's a good example of making things salient. It's also a bit banal. All these examples are always a bit banal. Just two further examples, well known. In Denmark, they started this, but the Food Standards Agency has also developed a similar thing, the food hygiene ratings in restaurants. It's very intuitive. There has been a study for the Norwegian Council of Ministers doing research on how people move through supermarkets, things that are visible, things that are not so visible. Putting healthy things in invisible places is not helpful, even if people are searching for healthy food. They tend to forget it or oversee. There has been a report by the Behavioral Insights team recently, a Manual for Change, that is characteristic of more recent developments showing how food politics, health politics, and sustainability and climate change are somehow interlinked also in behavioral public policies. They are combined because these policy areas are interlinked, and they have started to do some research on this and to offer some nudges and offer some complementary interlinked sets of nudges that will help to, as they would say, design the choice architecture of people so that their behavior is more sustainable. And why not? I mean, you could argue that's really a good idea if it helps. Why not do this? A not so successful example from a very famous deworming study in Kenya. Children, the basic idea is that children are not performing well in school because of worms. They are making their health fragile, influencing their health. So the basic idea was that giving them pills would change their behavior in school and would help them to learn better. This has been carried out for, I think, many years, at least a decade. And it was carried out inter alia by the Abdul Jamil Poverty Action Lab at the MIT. That is an organization, I will come to it a bit later, back to it, and an organization that is carrying out all these experiments. Esther Duflo, of course, has received the Nobel Prize with her colleagues for this. But this specific deworming study didn't work well. It showed that over a very long time, even if the first results of these experimental trials are successful, the long-term results may go in a very different direction. And since experimental trials are normally not designed for very long-term studies because they're expensive and complicated, we can assume that some of these nudges or even interventions, this is more than a nudge, obviously, that they might fail under certain conditions. And this is well known in the behavioral public policy community, nudges that fail. So they are starting to identify obstacles and methods and to get an understanding of this. Because whenever it's getting complicated, then we are really encountering the problems of nudging and of many behavioral public policies. This is a more recent example of what I, in the beginning, described with Brooke, and I mean, this article is, I think this has been published. The article by Brooke on this, it's very good, on the digital farmer just a few weeks ago. This is an example of this digitalization of agriculture, of farming, supported by the European Union, carried out by consulting companies. this is obviously a very modern way of doing farming, but it's not very surprising because the combination of mobile phone and drones, okay, it's impressive, but it's more a technicality, one could think. But the background of this is really a package approach. These firms, with the help of the World Bank and the European Union, are offering digital platforms, platforms of service, financial services, microfinance services, information, and other technologies as a package to help farmers to develop a more efficient way of doing farming. The core idea is nudging. It's really the core idea that people are overwhelmed cognitively, and that is also the core idea in research, for example, by Duflo and Banerjee and others who are very strong, of course, in development policy, that people are cognitively underprivileged, that they can't really decide what to do, that they need some kind of nudge in the right direction. So first experiments in this area started with mobile phones, but we are far beyond that now. These platforms are offering a whole set of choice architectures that help people to finance their projects, that give them the right tools, and that nudge them in the direction of becoming entrepreneurs of their own larger farming companies. So this is a more complex thing. Whether this really transforms farming is, I think, may be a part of your research, but I think it's at least a very good example of this kind of choice architectures, and also the expansion of this and the complexity of this and the interwovenness of public and private actors. We could really think about using Frank Fischer's term techno-corporatism, these arrangements that have evolved to change people's, in this case, farmers' behavior in the right direction. This is just one reform movement, but it is a globalized reform movement. This is a diagram we did on the spread of behavioral insights teams, units, advisory teams that are really working at the interface of science and policy. Most of them modeled after the behavioral insights team in the UK. And we found them really everywhere. There was a first spread. The first teams emerged in the relationship between the US and UK. But we have also other forerunners. Singapore, for example, a very famous forerunner. Australia and New Zealand were also very early. We're talking about 2006 to 10. Then a second phase from 2010 on. Some countries in Europe, for example, the Dutch behavioral science network, kind of a network between different ministries. So we have also very different forms of these. but especially the Scandinavian green nudge networks, or the Norwegian I nudge you, which were at that time specialized, not anymore, they've expanded also, but specialized in green politics, climate and sustainability. These teams are really different from the behavioral insights teams, which shows us that there are some varieties in behavioral public policy. And then it's spread to the international level, to South America. South America especially strong in these developments. And then there's much Turkey, and then very late other countries. And also, as you know, the unit Wirksam Regieren at the Chancellery, at the German Chancellery, which has been under a lot of criticism when it started, but it's very well connected. It's hard to talk to these people, and very, very interesting what they have to say. I can maybe talk a little bit more about it in the discussion. Let me move on. I'm taking a little bit too much time. We are in actually the first chapter of this, but I'm making it very brief. How can we explain this spread? How can we explain this globalization of behavioral public policy? And my argument was they are coupling political and epistemic authority. And my first element of this coupling would be expert networks. We did a kind of network analysis in for 2013 and for 2019, and try to understand how are they linked. And in 2013, in 2010, there wasn't much. Actually, we have also data for 2010. But then in 2013, we had several units, which are depicted here as red dots, and several ministries, also interlinked ministries and other organizations interlinked to these units, the blue dots. And we had cooperations, we had common projects, common lecture series. We all coded this and said it's a link. And of course, we could do a more fine-grained analysis of these interlinkages. My message being just at the moment, some important international hubs, like the already mentioned behavioral Abdul Jamil Poverty Action Lab, the JPAL, the team at the World Bank, they were already very influential. The larger dots are really showing their centrality. The Innovation Poverty Action Lab, which is closely connected to the JPAL, and already in 2013, the Min Edu Lab, actually part of a ministry of education in Peru, Denmark, and then a lot of other ministries and organizations. Now this has changed. 2020, these are the most recent data. Okay, I will wrap it up for you. More units, obviously. We are now at a number of 70 or 80 units in roughly 200 countries. More links with other organizations. I think the structure has changed a little bit. We have now, they have kind of functionally differentiated. We have hubs for every country or region. And then in the regions and countries, and then in the ministries, we have little mirroring teams that are able to communicate. And that is, I think, a second, this kind of differentiation as kind of a second development. And then we have obviously a form also of a strengthened inter and transnationalization. The European Union labs, the United Nations. I've already mentioned the World Bank. I would say this is a second, the transnationalization and internationalization of this, the involvement of inter and transnational organizations, second one, and the characteristic of these behavioral units, most of them, is that they are multitasking mediators. They have personnel from different disciplines, different people. They are very well connected. And mostly they have scientific people and they have people who have policy practice. They bring them together in their team. They're trying to connect them. And that is, I think, a very important thing. They're sometimes very small. My second argument, second form of trying to get political and epistemic authority, evidence hierarchies. And a second element of this is the parallel movement, actually. We have to bring these different movements together, is the spread of randomized controlled trials. Very important. As you know, the basic logic, we all know them. Now, under the conditions of a pandemic, we've all become specialists in randomized controlled trials, multi-armed variants, and so on. As you know, in evidence-based policy, they are very high up at the evidence pyramid. They are only, I mean, there's only one method higher, and these are systematic reviews and actually the meta-analysis of hundreds of randomized controlled trials. And these evidence hierarchies are pretty strong. People from our public health department tell me that even if they want to do some kind of different studies or multi-method things, they always ask to do randomized controlled trials first. And why is that? Randomized controlled trials are not only a scientific gold standard and still the prime method of identifying causal relations. They are also very helpful for policymakers because you can test your intervention. If you have a text letter and you put one sentence in it and you have a second letter and change the sentence and put them in randomized controlled trials, you can identify the mode of intervention that is more effective. And that is really something that is characteristic. And they are also reflecting this in the behavioral insights team. Not only make all these interventions easy and target their cognitive systems, but also make them easy for policymakers, also target their cognitive systems. It's very clear. There is a report on behavioral government, so they are really reflecting about this as well, as a part of getting epistemic, but also political authority, and it's a widespread. The JPAL is carrying out hundreds of these experiments across the world in different policy fields. We could also think about the colonization, a new colonization by methods, maybe. What does it mean for countries like Ghana? But the core message at the moment is really they can roll out a wave of these RCTs, make them learn from them not in time, but at the same time. That I think makes them was so efficient. It has always been a core argument by evidence-based policies since the mid-90s, that they are trying to de-ideologize politics and that they want to put forward some neutral, objective evidence so that decision-making can learn about its real impact and the situation of the facts. And my argument is that there are silent politics. And I briefly want to make this argument, and we can discuss about it later. And that's really what I'm interested in. Silent politics, and not only in the ways methodological problems are covered, or even in manipulation. I'm not talking about this. There may be some cherry picking and all these things. I'm talking about methods that, or evidence that is presented actually as being based on the highest standards of science that is closely interlinked to political processes, but that is the result of negotiations, political thinking, about indicators, about indicator systems, and about methods, and what you can gain with methods and what you lose with methods, what you don't see, what your areas of ignorance are. So I guess this is a kind of politics, but a very silent one. My other argument that I'm not going to present today is that they are followed by very loud politics, that the accusal of evidence-based policy being actually policy-based evidence is a result of these silent politics. And so we should think about evidence-based policy being a kind of source for the distrust in science. But that is a larger and different topic. So Andrea Freeman, in a wonderful article from 2016 has argued that behavioral politics in the field, in the area of food, really tend to ignore the multiple constraints on health improvements and food behavior. The role of prices, of income, the inequalities, the debt, the neighborhoods. Think of food deserts, large areas where you don't find any healthy food, the familial responsibilities, and so on. So there are all kinds of structural factors. If we look at the behavior of people who are poor and try to change this behavior, we are not trying to change the structures. That's the core element. Market forces are shaping, of course, the food environment, for example, in schools. Are we really thinking about regulating these market forces, or are we trying to do kind of a counter market? Then the industry control over food policy, a very similar problem, the large companies. Also, I can't go into detail here, but I think you all have been discussing this for ages, that there are really also some racial disparities in food-related illnesses. I mean, how about this dimension? So her argument is that expending resources on behavioral economics without enacting laws and regulations who are really designed to improve the health of individuals by looking into other factors represents a kind of a food oppression. It's really a silent politics. It's not oppressing you, obviously, but it's somehow a form of non-decisions. And in a similar way, Brooks, in this very recent article, arguments that under the banner of green revolution that is closely linked to these new forms of agriculture, the green revolution. I think it's a very a term that is very traditional in this field. That really under this banner, there is a commodification, especially in developing countries. So, and it has different sides. These modern ways of digital nudging and the precision agriculture, a term formed after precision medicine, something that is personalized, they are used as a kind of technofixes, where structural problems may be more important, but it's really enclosing people in choice architectures that are highly financialized, that are trying to form a market subject, an entrepreneur that is supposed to, well, that is supposed to overcome these structural obstacles by using all these financial products and services, and that is steered into this direction by information in environments. A subject that is defined primarily by the adoption of a kind of a prescribed menu of market behaviors. This is the way it goes. And that is maybe a second aspect of silent politicization in food politics. There's also a third thing I want to point your attention to, and that is the last thing I'm going to mention. The basic idea is that with all the problems connected to this, the citizens with their small cognitive bandwidth, the markets with all their behavioral market failures that really consumers that are based on an idea of consumer behavior that's not working, and the policymakers that have decision-making biases, that choice architects and behavioral experts are those who are able to debias society in a certain way. Debiasing has been an argument already by Kahneman and Tversky in their early years. And it shows that this is not about the problems of Homo economicus. It's not criticizing Homo economicus. It's trying to achieve Homo economicus by changing the biases, by correcting them. That is the core argument. And that is also an argument in the context of a debate on epistocracy, which is based in many ways on this understandings of the uninformed voter and the biased citizen. And that is the core argument of this well-known book by Jason Brennan, but also of others, that democracy is the wrong instrument. It simply doesn't work because people are biased. So if an instrument doesn't work, you have to change it. You have to add other instruments to it. And you have to find ways, for example, through restricting voting to those people who are well informed. So you have tests, knowledge tests, before you let people vote. And in this way, you make sure that the less unbiased have the chance to change policy. The epistocracy, as they call it, I think the correct term would be epistemocracy, but that's probably too complicated. The epistocracy as a goal, even as an alternative to democracy, and as a huge criticism against deliberation. Deliberation instruments are really, even Sunstein is criticizing deliberation as a highly problematic tool. So this is also the political dimension I want to show you. And in conclusion, I would say we have to look at competing authority constellations behind science and the state, because they have political influences and they may even change our understanding of democracy. Technologies of behavior that I've tried to give examples of, they can develop a political life of their own. They seem to be so banal, but in combinations and coupled to the private sector, they become alive, as more recent theories on instrument constituencies have argued. Instruments coming to life. And there is a silent politics. It's not only about politicization in the public through controversies and alternatives. There is also a kind of a silent politics that is based on non-decisions, on areas of ignorance, but also on very clear political goals. And understanding all this might also be helpful to understand how can we achieve critical criticism? How is critical expertise possible? Are there critical experts? Are there critical circles? How can they irritate this or add to this different ideas and thoughts? And I think that would be the ultimate goal. And behavioral public policy is just one example of many that we need to look at to understand the conditions of critical expertise. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for your attention under these very warm conditions. Thanks a lot, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. And I'm stopping my presentation now.